If one more expert tells me to replace another $1 million part, you're all fired. Richard Calloway's voice echoed through the sprawling, climate-controlled garage, sharp enough to silence the constant hum of diagnostic equipment. The words seemed to hang beneath the polished steel beams while more than 20 mechanics, engineers, and specialists stood frozen around the motionless Ferrari. The rare machine sat beneath brilliant white lights like a wounded masterpiece, its crimson paint reflecting every expensive mistake that had already been made. 3 months. More than $3 million. Specialists flown in from Italy, Germany, and California. Prototype scanners, factory engineers, custom machined components. Every attempt had ended exactly the same way. Silence. Richard stared at the lifeless supercar with exhausted eyes. It wasn't the money anymore. A man who built his fortune buying impossible companies and turning failure into profit had never accepted defeat from anything with an engine. Yet this Ferrari had become the one thing he couldn't conquer. Ethan Pierce, the chief engineer, slowly lowered a tablet displaying another page of confusing diagnostic reports. "We replaced everything the factory recommended," he said carefully. "Every sensor checks out. Every module communicates. Every voltage reading falls within specification." Richard folded his arms. "Then why won't it start?" No one answered. Somewhere in the enormous garage, a cooling fan clicked softly before falling silent again. The air carried the familiar scent of motor oil, fresh paint, warm electronics, and polished leather. But beneath it lingered something heavier, the quiet embarrassment of people who had run out of answers. Richard glanced toward the glass office overlooking the collection. Vintage Ferraris, Lamborghinis, McLarens, and Bugattis rested in perfect rows, each one worth more than most homes. Yet the only car he cared about today was the one refusing to wake up. "Try it again," he ordered. Ethan hesitated before climbing into the driver's seat. Every mechanic instinctively stepped back. He pressed the ignition. For one brief second, dozens of tiny lights illuminated the dashboard like a Christmas display, before everything instantly faded into darkness. The garage returned to complete stillness. Not even a click from the starter. Richard closed his eyes for a long moment. Enough. His voice was quieter now, somehow more intimidating than before. "Every hour this car sits here, someone invents another invoice. Every day, another expert promises they're close. Nobody is close." Outside, afternoon sunlight poured through towering windows, casting long golden reflections across the spotless concrete floor. At the far end of the building, a side entrance opened quietly. Angela Brooks stepped inside wearing a simple housekeeping uniform, pushing a cleaning cart polished almost as carefully as the cars surrounding her. She paused for only a second after hearing the silence inside the garage before lowering her eyes and continuing toward the service hallway. Walking beside her was her 14-year-old son, Noah Brooks, carrying a small backpack that looked worn from years of careful use. School had ended early, and Angela couldn't afford childcare during her evening shift. "Stay close," she whispered gently without looking at him. "Don't touch anything. Just wait until I'm finished." Noah nodded, but his eyes had already drifted toward the silent Ferrari glowing beneath the lights. He didn't see a price tag. He didn't see a billionaire's pride. He saw something else entirely, something that didn't seem broken at all. Angela guided her cleaning cart along the polished concrete floor with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned how to become invisible inside other people's wealth. Every movement was careful. Every wheel turned without a squeak. She knew that drawing attention inside Richard Calloway's garage usually meant someone believed something had gone wrong. Noah followed a few steps behind, keeping both hands on the straps of his backpack exactly as his mother had asked. His eyes, however, refused to stay on the floor. They wandered from one remarkable machine to another until they settled once again on the silent Ferrari surrounded by engineers wearing matching gray uniforms embroidered with factory certifications from around the world. Ethan Pierce noticed the teenager looking toward the car and sighed. "Kid, this is not a museum," he said, without raising his voice. "Stand back, please." Noah immediately nodded. "Yes, sir." There was no attitude in his answer, only respect. Angela offered an apologetic smile before continuing toward the glass walls that bordered the executive office. She sprayed cleaner onto a microfiber cloth and began wiping away fingerprints that nobody else had even noticed. Behind her, the engineers rolled another expensive diagnostic cart toward the Ferrari. Thick cables stretched across the floor like vines, while monitors displayed endless streams of numbers. Ethan watched every reading with growing frustration before finally shaking his head. Nothing changed. One technician muttered. Again. Another engineer folded his arms. Maybe the factory overlooked something. Ethan gave a tired laugh. The factory built the car. Several mechanics chuckled quietly, but the laughter carried more exhaustion than humor. Noah continued watching from a respectful distance. He did not stare at the people. He watched the rhythm of the work instead. Every technician moved with remarkable precision. Every expensive tool had its exact place. Every procedure followed a checklist. Yet something about the entire process felt strangely backward. Richard walked slowly around the Ferrari, running a hand across the flawless paint before stopping beside the front fender. "How many people have touched this car?" he asked. Ethan answered honestly. 43 specialists over the last 12 weeks. Richard looked at the silent machine for another moment, and every one of them charged me for certainty. No one responded. Angela quietly emptied a trash bin near the workbench while pretending not to hear the conversation. She had worked in enough wealthy homes to understand that silence was often the safest answer. Noah took one small step sideways for a better view of the engine bay before immediately stopping again. A security guard noticed the movement. "Easy there," he called, with a polite but unmistakably firm smile. That car costs more than most neighborhoods. A few technicians laughed. One added, "Do not worry, son. Even people with 10 engineering degrees cannot solve this one." Noah smiled politely instead of looking embarrassed. "I understand, sir." The answer surprised Ethan enough to glance at him again. Most teenagers would have argued or acted offended. This boy simply accepted the warning and kept observing from where he stood. Richard barely noticed the exchange. His attention remained fixed on the Ferrari, as though willing it to come back to life through determination alone. Across the garage, sunlight shifted through the towering windows, illuminating tiny particles of dust floating above the polished floor. Noah watched the reflection crawl across the hood until it reached the edge of the open engine compartment. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He leaned his head a fraction to one side, listening to the quiet that everyone else had already stopped hearing. Then, almost under his breath, he whispered words that only his mother could hear. "Mom, I do not think the car is actually broken." Angela paused in the middle of wiping the glass wall and lowered her voice before anyone else could hear. "Noah, please. We are here so I can finish my work. Not because anyone wants your opinion." Her words carried no anger, only the quiet caution that came from years of trying not to lose the jobs that kept food on the table. Noah nodded immediately. "I know, Mom." He looked back toward the Ferrari for only a second before forcing himself to focus on the floor. But the image refused to leave his mind. The open engine compartment, the untouched connectors, the fresh replacement parts that looked too perfect. They did not fit together in the way he expected. As Angela continued polishing the windows, Noah quietly took a seat on a small wooden bench near the service entrance. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out a notebook filled with neat sketches of engines, wiring diagrams, and handwritten observations. The pages were worn around the edges from being opened hundreds of times. Some drawings came from library books. Others came from online repair videos he watched late at night after finishing homework. The oldest sketches had been drawn beside someone else's handwriting. Strong, steady block letters labeled every component with patient precision. Fuel, ground, compression, timing. Listen before replacing. Noah gently ran his fingers across those words before closing the notebook again. 3 years earlier, his father, Daniel Brooks, had spent weekends rebuilding worn-out lawnmowers, pickup truck engines, and forgotten motorcycles behind a small repair shop on the edge of town. They had never owned expensive equipment. Sometimes they borrowed tools. Sometimes they repaired tools before they repaired the machines. Daniel always smiled whenever Noah asked why he listened to an engine with his eyes closed. "Machines tell you the truth," he would say. "People panic. Machines do not. If you stay quiet long enough, they explain exactly what is wrong." After Daniel passed away from an illness that arrived far too quickly, the repair shop closed within months. Bills replaced dreams. Angela accepted housekeeping jobs wherever she could find steady work. And Noah learned to study engines through borrowed books, public library computers, and videos that he watched over and over until every sound became familiar. Back inside the garage, another attempt was already underway. Ethan instructed two technicians to remove a recently installed electronic module. One mechanic carefully disconnected expensive wiring, while another unpacked an identical replacement still sealed inside factory packaging. Richard watched every movement without speaking. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was fading into routine frustration. Nobody questioned the process anymore because nobody had another idea. Noah noticed something that made him sit up slightly. Every technician looked directly at the diagnostic screens. Nobody looked at the entire car. Nobody stepped back. Nobody simply observed. They trusted numbers more than patterns. His father had warned him about that once. "Tools help you confirm the answer," Daniel had said with a smile while tightening a loose battery cable on an old truck. "They cannot replace your eyes or your ears." Noah quietly looked toward the Ferrari once more. His heartbeat remained calm, but the feeling in his chest grew stronger. Whatever had silenced that engine did not look complicated. It looked misunderstood. He glanced toward Angela, who was still working without raising her head, and decided to keep his thoughts to himself. For now, listening seemed wiser than speaking. The new control module slid into place with the soft metallic click of expensive engineering meeting expensive expectation. Ethan Pierce stepped back while another technician secured the final connector. Every movement practiced until it looked almost effortless. Richard Calloway folded his arms and watched without blinking. Around them, the garage had fallen into the same tense silence that always arrived before another attempt. One engineer nodded toward Ethan. "Everything is ready." Ethan inhaled slowly before pressing the ignition button once again. The dashboard illuminated for a heartbeat. Colored warning lights danced across the digital display. Then, just as before, every light disappeared. Nothing. No crank. No rumble. No heartbeat from 12 cylinders waiting to roar. Only silence. Ethan lowered his hand from the steering wheel without saying a word. Someone quietly disconnected another diagnostic cable, while another specialist opened a laptop already filled with hundreds of pages of data collected over the previous 12 weeks. Richard looked from one face to another. Nobody met his eyes. "Tell me what I am missing," he finally said. "Not another invoice, not another theory. Tell me what every expert in this room has failed to see." An older engineer cleared his throat. "Mr. Calloway, we have followed every factory procedure. We have inspected every electrical circuit, replaced every suspect component, recalibrated every control system, and verified every measurement." Richard looked toward the motionless Ferrari again. "Then perhaps the procedure is wrong." The sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Ethan looked down at the diagnostic tablet before quietly replying, "The factory procedures have never failed us before." Richard answered without raising his voice, "There is always a first time." Across the garage, Angela finished polishing the final section of glass and moved toward another work area with her cleaning cart. Noah remained seated, watching the conversation unfold. What caught his attention was not what anyone said. It was what nobody questioned. Every solution involved replacing another part. Every discussion returned to another screen filled with numbers. Nobody spoke about why the first failure had happened. Nobody asked what had changed before the car stopped running. The Ferrari had become a puzzle everyone was trying to solve by buying new pieces instead of understanding the picture. Two mechanics wheeled away another unopened shipping crate stamped with factory markings from Italy. Noah noticed the faded shipping labels stacked beside dozens of empty boxes from previous deliveries. Every crate represented another attempt, another expensive promise, another disappointment. Richard slowly walked around the Ferrari, his polished shoes echoing softly across the concrete floor. He rested one hand on the roof for a long moment before speaking almost to himself. "Money has solved every problem I have ever faced. Until now." Ethan heard the remark but offered no reply. There was nothing left to promise. The garage, once filled with confidence and technical certainty, now felt strangely small despite its enormous size. Afternoon sunlight continued drifting across the polished floor, reflecting gently against the crimson paint. Noah followed the shifting light until it reached the open engine bay once more. Something inside him whispered that everyone in the room was searching too hard in the wrong direction. He tightened his grip on his notebook but remained exactly where he was, remembering his father's words. Listen first. Speak only when silence has taught you something worth saying. The garage settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt heavier than silence itself. Engineers whispered over fresh reports while expensive diagnostic equipment continued collecting information that no longer seemed to matter. Richard Calloway stood beside the motionless car with both hands in his pockets, staring at the polished hood as though determination alone could bring it back to life. Nobody noticed Noah had quietly stood from the bench. He walked only a few feet closer, stopping well behind the yellow safety line painted across the floor. He respected boundaries. He had no intention of crossing them. From there, he could finally see the entire vehicle instead of only the exposed engine compartment. His eyes moved slowly from the front grille to the windshield, across the roofline, toward the rear quarter panel, and finally back to the open hood. He was not searching for broken parts. He was searching for a story. Every machine carried one. His father had taught him that long before teaching him how to hold a wrench. A machine never failed without leaving clues behind. Sometimes those clues were hidden in sound. Sometimes they appeared in heat, vibration, or even the pattern of dust that settled where it should not. Noah narrowed his eyes. Something felt strangely out of place, not damaged, not worn, simply wrong. A faint smell drifted through the garage as another technician disconnected a battery charger. Most people would have noticed only the familiar scent of warm electronics and clean metal. Noah caught something else underneath it. It reminded him of the old alternator his father once repaired after another mechanic had solved the wrong problem 3 different times. Daniel Brooks had laughed that afternoon while handing Noah a flashlight. The biggest mistake smart people make, he had said, is believing the last repair must have been correct. Noah could almost hear those words echoing through the garage. His attention settled on one corner of the engine bay. He could not fully see the component from where he stood, but its position bothered him in a way he could not explain. Everything around it looked factory perfect. That single detail did not. It looked as though it belonged somewhere else. He frowned slightly, trying to remember the layout from diagrams he had studied months earlier at the public library. Behind him, Angela finished replacing the trash liners near the workbench before noticing her son standing quietly with his eyes fixed on the Ferrari again. She walked over, carrying a folded microfiber cloth. "Noah," she whispered gently, "please do not get lost in your thoughts. We will be finished soon." He turned toward her with the same calm expression she knew so well. "I am trying, Mom." She smiled softly and brushed a small speck of dust from his shoulder. "Your father used to look at engines exactly like that." Noah glanced back toward the silent car. He always said people sometimes repair the symptoms instead of the mistake. Angela's smile faded into thoughtful silence. She remembered hearing Daniel say those exact words countless evenings while washing grease from his hands after work. Before she could answer, Richard's frustrated voice echoed across the garage once again. "Does anyone here have an idea we have not already paid for?" The question lingered unanswered. Noah looked at his mother, then back at the Ferrari. For the first time since entering the garage, he wondered whether remaining silent was still the right thing to do. Richard's question remained suspended in the air long after the echoes disappeared into the high steel ceiling. Nobody answered. Several engineers exchanged uncertain glances before returning to their tablets, hoping another scan would reveal what weeks of scanning had hidden. Ethan Pierce rubbed the bridge of his nose and quietly dismissed 2 technicians to prepare yet another round of electrical testing. Angela gently touched Noah's arm. "Come on," she whispered. "Let us finish and head home." Noah looked at her, then toward the silent Ferrari one more time. The uneasy feeling in his chest had only grown stronger. He took a slow breath. "Mom," he said softly, "may I ask something?" Angela immediately sensed where the question was leading. Her expression filled with concern. "Noah, please." He nodded respectfully, but before he could step away, Richard's voice reached them from across the garage. "What is it?" Noah looked up, surprised the billionaire had heard him. Every conversation inside the garage stopped at once. Richard walked a few steps closer, curiosity replacing frustration for the first time that afternoon. "You wanted to ask something," he said. "Go ahead." Noah swallowed carefully. "Sir, may I look at the car?" A quiet laugh escaped from one of the younger technicians before he could stop himself. Another mechanic smiled politely, believing the request came from simple curiosity. Ethan folded his arms. "Son, this is not an exhibit at an auto show. Every certified engineer in this room has already inspected that car." Noah met his eyes without any trace of arrogance. "Yes, sir. I know," Ethan continued. "People have spent months trying to solve this. Factory specialists flew across the ocean to work on it." Noah nodded again. "I understand." Richard studied the teenager for several silent seconds. He had expected confidence or youthful stubbornness. Instead, he saw neither. The boy stood quietly beside his mother with relaxed shoulders and calm eyes, as though asking permission to borrow a library book rather than approach one of the rarest automobiles in the country. Angela stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Calloway, I am very sorry. He does not mean any disrespect. His father used to repair engines, and Noah simply loves machines. We will leave you to your work." Noah lowered his eyes. "I am sorry if I interrupted, sir." Richard looked from Angela to Noah, and then back toward the Ferrari. The expensive silence surrounding the car suddenly felt heavier than the risk of letting a respectful teenager satisfy his curiosity. "How long do you need?" Richard asked. Ethan turned sharply. "Richard." The billionaire raised one hand without taking his eyes off Noah. "I asked him a question." Noah answered honestly. 30 seconds would be enough. This time, the room did not laugh. It simply stared. Ethan let out a slow breath, almost unable to believe what he had heard. 30 seconds? He repeated. Noah nodded. "I only want to look. I will not touch anything, unless you tell me I may." Richard glanced around the garage filled with experts, invoices, computers, and replacement parts worth more than many families would earn in a lifetime. Then he looked back at the quiet 14-year-old standing beside a housekeeping cart. 30 seconds, he said calmly. "You may look. Nothing more." Noah whispered, "Thank you, sir," and slowly stepped toward the yellow safety line as every eye in the garage followed him in complete silence. Noah stopped just short of the Ferrari, careful not to cross the final strip of yellow tape until Ethan gave a reluctant nod. The teenager moved with remarkable patience, almost as though he were entering a library instead of a garage filled with machines worth millions of dollars. Every engineer watched him with folded arms. Several exchanged amused glances, convinced the next 30 seconds would simply confirm what they already knew. Ethan checked his watch. "Your time starts now," he said evenly. Noah quietly thanked him and stepped beside the open engine bay. He did not reach for a tool. He did not ask for a scanner. Instead, he slowly walked around the front of the car, studying the reflections dancing across the paint. Richard noticed something unusual. The boy was not looking at individual parts. He was looking at the entire vehicle, almost as though trying to understand how every piece belonged to every other piece. One mechanic whispered to another, "He looks like he is solving a puzzle." His coworker smiled. "He is 14 years old. In another 20 seconds, he will realize why professionals spent 3 months on this." Ethan remained silent, although skepticism was written across his face. Noah crouched slightly near the front bumper before standing again. His eyes traced the edges of the engine compartment without touching a single component. He tilted his head, listening. The garage was almost perfectly quiet except for distant ventilation fans and the faint ticking of cooling metal. Richard frowned. "What exactly is he listening for?" Ethan answered with a shrug. "I have no idea." Noah slowly circled to the driver's side, stopping again as though something had caught his attention. He closed his eyes for only a moment. The habit instantly reminded Angela of Daniel. Countless evenings she had watched her husband do exactly the same thing before diagnosing an engine everyone else believed required expensive repairs. Her hands tightened around the cleaning cart. She was no longer worried Noah might embarrass himself. She was worried people would laugh before they even gave him a chance to finish thinking. One of the younger technicians finally spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Kid, that battery management system alone costs more than your house." A few quiet chuckles followed. Another mechanic added, The diagnostic software we are using probably costs more than every car in your school parking lot combined. Noah looked toward them and smiled politely. There was no resentment in his expression. I believe you, sir. The simple answer somehow made the laughter disappear faster than any argument could have. Richard noticed it too. The teenager seemed completely uninterested in proving anyone wrong. He only wanted to understand the machine standing in front of him. Ethan glanced at his watch again. 10 seconds left. Noah nodded softly. Instead of stepping away, he leaned just enough to look deeper into one corner of the engine compartment. His breathing slowed, his eyes focused on a single area no larger than the palm of his hand. He still did not touch anything. Richard watched the subtle change in the boy's expression. It was not excitement. It was recognition. Almost as though Noah had just found something he had expected to see all along. Then, with only a few seconds remaining, Noah quietly looked up and spoke in the calmest voice anyone had heard all afternoon. Sir, I think everyone has been trying to repair the wrong problem. The words settled over the garage more heavily than the silence that had come before them. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a keyboard or a wrench. Ethan Pierce looked at Noah with narrowed eyes, uncertain whether he had just heard confidence or coincidence. The wrong problem? He repeated slowly. Noah nodded once. Yes, sir. One of the technicians let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like another laugh, but Richard raised a hand before anyone could speak. Explain, he said. Noah remained exactly where he was, beside the open engine compartment. I do not think replacing more parts will help. Ethan crossed his arms. And why would you think that? Noah kept his voice respectful. Because every new part is behaving exactly like the old one. Several engineers exchanged puzzled glances. Noah continued before anyone interrupted. If every replacement produces the same result, then maybe the parts were never the real problem. Richard's attention sharpened immediately. The sentence was simple, almost obvious, yet nobody in the room had said it aloud during the past 3 months. Ethan remained cautious. That is an interesting theory. What makes you believe it? Noah looked toward the engine bay again. Something happened before the first failure. Something changed. Since then, everyone has been trying to repair what stopped working instead of asking what caused it to stop. The garage fell quiet once more. Richard slowly looked around the room filled with specialists. Every report on every laptop documented repairs after the breakdown. None of them explained what had happened immediately before it. Ethan finally stepped beside Noah. You keep looking at the same area, he observed. What do you see? Noah hesitated. May I get a little closer? Richard answered first. You may. Noah carefully leaned toward the engine compartment without placing a hand on the vehicle. His eyes followed a single wiring path before stopping near a small mounting bracket tucked deep beside the firewall. He remained there for several long seconds, studying the tiny details that everyone else had overlooked because they seemed too ordinary to matter. Angela stood motionless beside her cleaning cart. Her heart was racing, yet Noah appeared calmer than ever. She remembered countless evenings watching Daniel pause exactly like this before speaking. He always said the first answer that came into your head was usually the loudest one, not the truest one. The true answer arrived only after the noise disappeared. Noah slowly straightened. Sir, he said softly, I think someone fixed something that was never broken. Ethan frowned. Which part? Noah gently shook his head. I am not sure yet. Several mechanics immediately relaxed, believing the moment had ended. But Noah finished his thought before anyone turned away. I do know this. Whatever changed was not installed at the factory this way. Richard's eyes shifted back toward the engine. Ethan followed the teenager's gaze to the exact corner Noah had been studying. It was a place every technician had seen dozens of times without giving it a second thought. For the first time that afternoon, Ethan felt something unexpected settle into the pit of his stomach. It was not certainty. It was curiosity. Noah lifted his hand but stopped several inches short of the engine compartment. May I point? He asked quietly. Richard nodded. Go ahead. Every pair of eyes followed the teenager's finger as it hovered toward a narrow section near the rear of the engine bay. It was not pointing at the engine block, the control module, or any of the expensive components that had been replaced over the past 3 months. Instead, he indicated a small braided ground strap fastened beside a mounting bracket. It looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Ethan leaned closer. That? Noah nodded. Yes, sir. One of the technicians frowned. "We inspected every ground connection weeks ago," Noah answered politely. "I believe you did." The technician folded his arms. "Then why are you looking there?" Noah took a slow breath before speaking. "Because it looks like someone moved it." Ethan immediately shook his head. "That bracket has not changed." Noah remained calm. "I do not think it belongs on that side of the mounting point." The garage became silent again. Ethan stepped closer, lowering himself until his eyes were level with the braided cable. "Why would you think that?" Noah searched for the right words. "The cable is resting under tension. It wants to pull the other direction." Ethan looked again. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the slight twist running through the braid. It was subtle, almost invisible, unless someone specifically looked for it. Noah continued softly. "If it was installed that way at the factory, the cable would naturally rest flat. This one is constantly trying to rotate back." Richard watched Ethan's expression change almost imperceptibly. The chief engineer reached for a flashlight and illuminated the mounting point. Fine circular marks surrounded the bolt head. "That could simply be from previous repairs," another engineer suggested. Noah nodded. "It could." He paused before adding, "But the paint mark beside the bolt no longer lines up." Ethan froze for a second. He aimed the flashlight more carefully. A tiny white inspection mark stretched across the bracket and bolt head, but the lines were separated by only a fraction of an inch. It was the kind of detail almost nobody noticed after repeated disassembly. Richard stepped closer. "What does that mean?" Ethan answered without taking his eyes off the bracket. "Factory technicians often apply alignment paint after final assembly," Noah quietly added. "If someone reinstalled it one position off, the electrical path might still test correctly most of the time. But under load..." He stopped, unsure whether he should continue. Richard encouraged him. "Finish your thought." Noah looked at the silent Ferrari. "Under load, it could create an intermittent grounding problem that confuses every control system at once. Replacing computers would never solve it because the computers are only reacting to the wrong signal." Nobody spoke. Ethan slowly reached into his toolbox and selected the exact socket needed for the mounting bolt. He did not remove it. He simply rested the tool against the fastener while staring at the tiny inspection mark. Finally, he looked at Richard. "If he is right, we have been chasing symptoms instead of the original mistake." Richard glanced from the engineer to Noah, then back to the small braided strap that nobody had considered important enough to question. For the first time in months, the room no longer felt trapped inside an impossible mystery. It felt as though the answer had been quietly waiting in plain sight. No one spoke, as Ethan Pierce carefully positioned the socket over the mounting bolt. The metallic click echoed through the garage with surprising clarity, as though every sound had suddenly become louder. Richard Calloway remained perfectly still beside the Ferrari, his attention fixed on the tiny braided ground strap that had somehow escaped months of scrutiny. Angela held the handle of her cleaning cart so tightly that her knuckles turned pale, while Noah simply watched in silence. There was no excitement on his face, only quiet concentration. Ethan loosened the bolt by less than a single turn before stopping. "The alignment mark is definitely off," he murmured. Another engineer immediately leaned in with a flashlight. "I never noticed that." Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "Neither did I." He gently lifted the braided strap just enough to examine the bracket beneath it. A faint, polished imprint appeared beside the current mounting position. It looked like a shadow left behind by a part that had once rested somewhere else. Ethan stared at it for several long seconds before exhaling slowly. "This is the original contact surface." Richard stepped closer. "Meaning?" Ethan looked up. "Someone reinstalled the ground strap after a previous repair. It is secure, but it is not sitting where the factory intended." One technician frowned. "Would that really shut down the entire vehicle?" Ethan answered honestly. "It should not," Noah quietly added, "unless the control modules are receiving unstable reference voltage during startup." Ethan looked toward him. The teenager immediately lowered his eyes. "That is only what I think, sir." Richard spoke before anyone else could. "Try it." Ethan nodded. With extraordinary care, he removed the bolt completely, rotated the braided strap into the position indicated by the faint wear marks, and aligned the tiny white inspection paint exactly as it had originally been applied. The twisted tension disappeared almost instantly. The cable now rested naturally against the bracket without trying to pull away. Ethan paused, studying it. "That already looks more correct," one mechanic admitted quietly. Another technician reconnected the battery system, while Ethan tightened the mounting bolt to specification. He checked it twice before stepping away from the engine compartment. Nobody reached for another replacement part. Nobody connected another diagnostic computer. Richard looked toward Ethan. "Well?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the driver's seat once again. The garage became absolutely silent. Even the ventilation fans seemed distant now. Noah instinctively held his breath. Angela closed her eyes for a brief second. Richard folded his arms without saying a word. Ethan rested one finger on the ignition button. "Here goes." He pressed it once. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the dashboard illuminated with crisp confidence, instead of flickering uncertainty. A fraction of a second later, the starter engaged smoothly. The engine turned once, then twice, before 12 cylinders came alive in one deep, unmistakable roar that rolled through the entire garage like distant thunder. The polished concrete floor seemed to hum beneath everyone's feet. Engineers froze exactly where they stood. One technician slowly lowered the diagnostic tablet from his hands, without realizing he had done it. Richard did not smile. He simply stared at the Ferrari, as its steady idle filled the room with a sound nobody had heard in months. Then, almost in disbelief, Ethan whispered the only words that seemed possible. It was the ground strap. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The steady rhythm of the engine filled every corner of the garage, echoing gently against the polished glass walls and rows of priceless automobiles. It was not simply the sound of a machine running. It was the sound of 3 months of frustration dissolving into quiet disbelief. Ethan Pierce remained behind the steering wheel, both hands resting motionless, as he watched every gauge settle exactly where it belonged. Oil pressure, voltage, engine temperature. Every number appeared perfectly normal. One by one, the warning lights disappeared until the instrument panel showed nothing but calm certainty. He slowly turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt almost louder than the roar that had come before it. Richard Calloway continued staring at the Ferrari without blinking. His reflection shimmered faintly across the crimson paint, while dozens of unanswered questions crossed his mind. He had spent a lifetime believing that every difficult problem could be solved by hiring the most qualified people, purchasing the finest equipment, and refusing to accept failure. Yet the answer had arrived wearing worn sneakers and carrying a backpack filled with handwritten notes instead of engineering credentials. Ethan quietly climbed out of the driver's seat and walked back toward the rear of the car. He looked at the small braided ground strap again, almost unable to believe such an ordinary detail had hidden behind so much complexity. "We replaced computers," he said softly. "Sensors, modules, harnesses. We even requested engineering support from the factory." He paused before looking toward Noah. "And we never questioned the one repair that came before all the others." Noah lowered his eyes respectfully. "Sometimes the first mistake hides behind the second one, sir." Ethan smiled faintly. "Your father taught you that?" Noah nodded. "Yes, sir. He always said every repair tells a story if you read it from the beginning instead of the end." Angela looked down, blinking away the memories that suddenly returned with remarkable clarity. She could almost hear Daniel explaining the same lesson beside an old pickup truck with grease on his hands and a patient smile on his face. Richard finally turned toward Noah. His expression no longer carried frustration or authority. It carried genuine curiosity. "How old are you?" he asked. 14, sir." Richard let the answer settle. 14 years old. He looked around the garage at specialists with decades of experience, advanced certifications, and tools worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. None of them had lacked intelligence. They had simply stopped asking the simplest question. Richard walked slowly toward Noah until only a few feet separated them. "You never claimed you could repair the car," he said quietly. Noah shook his head. "No, sir. I only thought everyone might be looking in the wrong place." Richard nodded almost to himself. "There is a difference." His eyes drifted toward Angela. "You raised a respectful young man." Angela smiled modestly. "His father deserves most of the credit, sir. Noah has simply never stopped listening to him." Richard glanced once more at the Ferrari before looking back at the teenager. For the first time that afternoon, he realized the most valuable thing inside the garage had never been sitting beneath the lights. It had quietly walked through the service entrance beside a mother who only came to do her job. Richard remained silent for a long moment before turning toward Ethan Pierce. "I want to know exactly when that ground strap was moved," he said calmly. "Not to blame anyone. I want to understand how every one of us missed something so simple." Ethan nodded. "I will review every service record from the beginning." He walked to a nearby workstation and opened the vehicle history. Every repair, every inspection, every shipment of replacement parts appeared on the screen. The first major repair dated back almost 4 months, shortly after the Ferrari had been transported following a routine maintenance visit. Ethan's eyes paused on a single entry. "There was an electrical inspection after the transport," he said quietly. The technician noted a loose connection near the rear of the engine compartment. Richard stepped beside him, and after that, Ethan scrolled through the records. Everything else happened afterward. Every replacement, every failed startup, every diagnostic report. He slowly leaned back in his chair. The first repair created every repair that followed. Noah listened without saying a word. He had never wanted anyone to be embarrassed. He only wanted the Ferrari to make sense again. Richard looked toward him. "You solved a problem that consumed some of the finest automotive minds I could hire." Noah shook his head gently. "No, sir, they solved it. I only noticed where to look." Richard smiled faintly. "That answer tells me even more than finding the problem did." Angela placed a hand lightly on her son's shoulder. "We should probably let everyone get back to work." Richard immediately replied, "Not yet." His tone remained warm, completely different from the frustration that had filled the garage earlier that afternoon. He looked at Noah again. "Tell me something honestly. Do you want to become an engineer?" Noah hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir. More than anything." Richard noticed the hesitation. "Why did you pause?" Noah glanced toward his mother. "Because wanting something and being able to afford it are not always the same thing." The words settled gently over the room. No one tried to interrupt them. Ethan quietly closed the service records and looked toward Angela with new understanding. He had spent the entire afternoon seeing a housekeeper and her son. Only now did he realize he had been standing beside a family carrying years of knowledge, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. Richard walked toward the large windows overlooking the collection of automobiles. Sunlight stretched across the polished floor, reflecting from dozens of carefully restored machines. "When I was young," he said, without turning around, "people assumed success belonged only to those who started with advantages. I spent years proving them wrong. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that talent does not arrive wearing a business suit." He faced Noah once more. "Your father gave you something far more valuable than technical skills. He taught you how to think." Noah smiled softly. "He always said the answer usually whispers. People just get too busy to hear it." Richard nodded. "Your father was a wise man." Angela lowered her eyes for a moment, holding back tears that came not from sadness but from hearing Daniel's wisdom spoken aloud by someone who had never met him. In the quiet that followed, every person inside the garage seemed to understand that the afternoon had become about far more than a Ferrari. It had become a reminder that genuine ability can appear from places the world too often overlooks. Richard walked slowly toward the service entrance where Angela's cleaning cart still stood exactly where she had left it, the spray bottle catching the last rays of the afternoon sun. For a moment, the billionaire looked at the cart instead of the Ferrari. One represented wealth beyond imagination. The other represented honest work performed quietly every day without applause. He turned back to Noah. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I want you and your mother to come back here, not to clean." Noah blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. Richard continued, "I want to introduce you to a friend of mine who oversees an engineering academy. They have programs for gifted students, scholarships, internships, and mentors who care more about curiosity than family income." Noah looked at Angela before answering. "Sir, I do not know what to say." Richard smiled gently. "You already said the most important thing today. You listened before speaking." Ethan Pierce stepped forward carrying Noah's notebook, which had been left on the bench earlier. He handed it back carefully, almost as though it contained something priceless. "May I see this again someday?" he asked. Noah smiled. "Of course, sir." Ethan opened the first page for only a second before closing it again. Hand-drawn wiring diagrams filled the paper, each one carefully labeled, corrected, and revised. They were not the work of someone pretending to understand machines. They were the work of someone who genuinely loved them. Ethan extended his hand. "Thank you for reminding me that experience should never replace curiosity." Noah shook it with quiet respect. Angela looked around the garage one final time. Just hours earlier, she had hoped only to finish her shift without causing trouble. Now, the same room felt completely different. Nobody looked past her anymore. Nobody saw only a housekeeping uniform. They saw a mother who had protected her son's dream through difficult years, and a boy who carried his father's lessons into a place where no one expected to find them. Richard walked toward the Ferrari one last time and rested his hand lightly on the roof. The engine started instantly when Ethan pressed the ignition, its smooth idle filling the garage with calm confidence instead of frustration. Richard listened for a moment before switching it off again. Then he looked at Noah. "Machines can be repaired," he said quietly. "The harder task is repairing the way we judge people." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "My father used to say every person has a story before they have a job." Richard smiled. I believe he was right. Outside, the evening sky glowed with soft shades of gold and deep blue as Angela and Noah stepped through the service entrance together. Noah glanced back only once. Richard and Ethan were still standing beside the Ferrari, but neither of them was looking at the car anymore. They were watching a 14-year-old boy walk away with nothing in his hands except an old backpack and a notebook full of dreams. The garage became quiet again. Yet it no longer felt empty. Somewhere beneath the fading light, one simple truth lingered long after the engine had fallen silent. Real greatness is not measured by the price of what you own. It is revealed by the wisdom you are willing to recognize, no matter who carries it.